Hello and welcome back to our weekly PWM Tea Break series here at the FT headquarters in London. Unfortunately, my co-host Yuri Bender is away on other duties, but I'm delighted to say we have a very special guest today, a regular commentator on PWM, Arnab Das, global macro strategist at Invesco. Arnab, great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
You've gone for the coffee today, not the tea, breaking away from tradition.
Well, I do like to have tea from time to time, but I saw the kind of teas that they had. They didn't have masala chai, right? Which is a very, we're in a spicy time, I thought, so I'll go for the coffee instead.
But I've gone for the green tea, and it hopefully helps me digest all the news this week. And there's been a lot of news in Europe. It seems to be in a state of political upheaval. Last week, the global chief investment officer at Edmund de Rothschild Asset Management said Europe always waits until the last minute. And, now with France's government collapsing, and Germany holding elections in February, I guess will last-minute Europe unite? Do they have the political will, do you think?
There's an old, kind of almost a cliche now from one of the founding fathers of the EU, Jean Monnet, Europe will be forged in crisis, right? And so here we are. We have another political, at least, turmoil, shock, maybe crisis. I think they will come together more than they have. I think we see more signs of that in many respects. This idea that's been floated, I guess, today about issuing a common defense bond on a voluntary basis. So ahead of Trump, let's say they're figuring out ways to do, and it's almost the last minute now because the inauguration is just around the corner. But having said that, I don't think we're looking at a full union. Kind of the Hamiltonian moment, that they talk about from time to time, which would be a full political and fiscal union and really complete the monetary union that already exists and is generally operating very well. I think that seems still to be off the table. I think it's going to take something much more serious, if we can imagine what that might be, in order to get there. But nevertheless, it'll be progress. Maybe it'll be last minute. And in a way, I sort of agree that the pressure and the threat of Trump, both on trade and on, to some extent, pulling the plug, or at least, tugging the rug out from under NATO to some extent, is putting a lot of pressure on Europe. And I think in a way, it's a good thing. If it's a last-minute continent, it needs pressure to get stuff done.
Who do you think in Europe could kind of lead this resurgence? Out of all the countries, who do you think can lead it?
Well, this is another, leads to another great cliche about Europe, right? Going back to Henry Kissinger, he famously said, if I want to talk to Europe, who do I call? And I think this is, by design, it's a difficult question to answer. Because Europe, of course, is a confederation where a bunch of countries have pooled their sovereignty. So, famously, the European institutions have 5 presidents, right? You got the president of the ECB, you got the president of the Commission, president of the Parliament, and so on. So it's difficult to know who's really going to be the leader. And I think, really what it requires is the famous Franco-German axis to be operating in tandem. And it's a little bit challenged because, as we were talking about before, the German coalition has come apart, the French government has come apart. We still have Macron in place. I don't think he's going anywhere, at least until 2027 when his term runs out. So I think we need to see who the next chancellor of Germany will be. And then maybe there's a way to bridge the gap and have Macron, Scholz's replacement probably merits, Meloni to a significant degree, and perhaps even to some extent Keir Starmer, although we've Brexited. When it comes to defense and foreign policy, there should be much more room for coordination and cooperation with the UK.
And while Europe seems to be on edge, I guess moving from one political crisis to another in East Asia, we saw this shocking news this week. South Korean President Yoon, the declaration of martial law that kind of sent shockwaves, I guess, across the board, which brings me to this interesting article on its neighboring country, Japan, which was written by Alex Hart, Japanese equity specialist at Sumitomo Asset Management. He says Japanese economic recovery is driven by private market sector dynamism, and which showing resilience. Now, I guess with South Korea in disarray and Europe at a crossroads, could Tokyo rise above this chaos?
I think there's a good argument to say that, at least to a significant degree, Japan is back, right? There's growth, there's reflation. Inflation, is for a while now has been above target, and the BOJ, is finally moving the needle on monetary policy. So I think you're right, and I think this chap is right to point out that there is some dynamism, and I think that's a very good thing. I think when it comes to Korea and Japan, I think we also naturally have to look at this through a geopolitical lens, because of course the elephant in the room is China. Japan is going to be intrinsically closer to the U.S. Than perhaps South Korea will be if there is a shift towards the center left in Korea as opposed to the center right. Of course, this is a bit of a surprise, if not baffling, kind of shock that's taken place. It looks like in South Korea itself, it looks like it was a miscalculation in many respects, politically and kind of tactically as well, right? The wrong thing to do, judging by the reaction of the Korean people as well as the political system. So I think it's a good thing in a way for South Korea that its institutions have sort of righted the ship of state. But I think that for the South Korea-Japan relationship, which together with Joe Biden there had been a bit of a rapprochement that had been engineered, that might be a little less coalesced now, right? We'll have to see, but that's one possible risk that comes out of this. And I think that if that's the case, it'll end up pushing Japan that much closer to the U.S., right? And I think that's in some respects that's also good for the dynamism of the Japanese economy and the dynamism of the Tokyo stock market, because it might imply somewhat less competitive pressure in the economy and for the corporate sector from China, right? It might imply, I think it will imply, a somewhat closer relationship with the U.S., subject to the famous Trump tariffs, which I'm sure we'll get onto.
Going to the U.S., actually, we had this fascinating article by Christy Newton's co-head at CP Capital. She argues that the U.S. real estate offers stability and transparency, especially for investors seeking diversification. I guess we have a new president coming in, Donald Trump. We've heard a lot about him recently. And how might his policies, for example, on mass deportation, kind of affect the stability and the long-term prospects of the U.S. multifamily real estate market? What are the tailwinds there?
President Trump, President-elect, I guess we could say Trump, has a multifaceted agenda that involves quite a lot of radical ideas. And I think the way to think about this is that they want to, he and his inner circle, like-minded people, they want to, obviously, they want to make America great again. And of course, what they have in mind is a small state nationalist agenda. I think some of the ideas that they have in this regard, including the mass deportation and the choking off the inflow of immigrants, particularly illegal immigrants, the tariffs, a lot of these ideas would in principle could be stagflationary or inflationary, depending on how they're implemented. I don't think that's what they're going to do, okay, is to bring about a stagflation or a big inflation. I mean, if you ask me what reelected President Trump, inflation, immigration, identity, and inequality. And so, the thing about inflation, if you pursue policies that are inflationary, people in most countries don't like it, and especially in the US, many people live on the edge. It increases inequality. I would say immigration has helped the Fed to deliver disinflation with little or no sacrifice in terms of employment or in terms of growth. So how they're going to square that circle remains to be seen. I would say what they're going to do is try to choke off the flow of illegal immigrants, and we're not really going to be looking at enormous numbers of mass deportations. I think, Trump is given to hyperbole. He likes to tell tall tales to make a point and to have a kind of rapport with the electorate and with his base, and it's obviously very effective. So it comes down to this question of should we take him seriously or literally, which was kind of a question in the first election, in the first administration of Trump. I think we should take him seriously, but not literally on these kinds of issues. So I think it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to have a mass deportation of 10 million people. I think you can increase the number of deportations and you can choke off the flow of illegals to some extent, maybe even to a significant extent, and I think that's more in his power to do than the mass deportations. I think the legal migration, they will try to slow that down, but it'll continue. Where does that leave the real estate market? I think markets in general in the US are going to continue to outperform the rest of the world, with the possible exception of the bond market, right? Because I think what we're talking about is not necessarily a big increase in the fiscal deficit, but an effort to increase the growth rate, which may have some inflationary consequences, would slow down the Fed's easing, maybe flip the Fed towards tightening sooner than otherwise. It's already sort of being priced into the market. Now, is that good for real estate? Well, I think, normally you might think higher rates than otherwise, potentially higher inflation. Some of it's good, inflation, a bit of a hedge in real estate. The higher rates, maybe not so good. Look, I think on balance, he's going to put America first, and I think US markets as a whole are going to continue to outperform, like I say, the rest of the world. And I think that'll include real estate. But having said that, I think I would look, not at myself. If I were to approach real estate as a portfolio investor, I would look at it in segments of real estate markets, in pockets, right? Having made a kind of decision to go into real estate, I would pick and choose spots and be more bottom up once I've made that decision.
We also have kind of concern abroad. We also have a concerned reader here. Danish Afsar, a fund manager from India, he asks, what will the going forward scenario of a US post-election strategy be? What would it be? How will it shape countries like China, Russia, and India, and in particular India, as Danish is from here?
From India.
How will it shape it?
Okay, I'm originally from India myself, but live here in the UK, grew up in the US, a little bit of everything. Look, I think India is itself is probably the country that is possibly the most hedged for US elections, because I think there's an inexorable kind of alignment that's taking place between India and the West, and India and the US in particular, because of the rise of China. In some respects they're rivals. There's a lot of tension. It's ameliorated now, but there's a lot of tension because of the border conflict that flares up from time to time on the northeast border of India, China, Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh. So I think there's a kind of inexorable alignment that's taking place, less than an alliance, but a coming together. The opposite is clearly true with China, even though there might be some areas for cooperation even under Trump. I think the general status that we're looking at here is a kind of stalemate rivalry between the US and China. And with Russia, I think the challenge for Russia is, and the challenge for Europe and the US as well, is how to deal with the Ukraine conflict, and what that dealing with that conflict implies for the Russia-China axis that seems to be forming. I think to some extent the Trump administration, or at least Trump himself, might like to split Russia and China, sort of reverse the Nixon in China phenomenon that we've been living through for several decades. I think that's going to be quite hard to do, and I think he knows that, and I think that's the message of some of these very hawkish people, that like Rubio and Walz, that he's nominated for Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. So I think we're looking at a very continued, complicated, and tense relationship between the US and China, and the US and Russia, and a generally friendly relationship with disturbances here and there with India. I think from a market's point of view, I think India is going to do, over time, is going to continue to do quite well, because I think things have changed. The country is now becoming about growth and becoming about making money and becoming a little less about bureaucracy and kind of idealism that can't be delivered, right? And more sort of pragmatic about a lot of things.
Arnab, it's a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you for having me.